Welcome 1,500 of you who've signed up for this event across the globe. As you'll see in the chat, people are coming in from China, Nigeria, Russia, and other places, as well as across the USA and Canada. We'd like to welcome back those of you who joined us last week for Professor Mauro Guillen's presentation on preparing for the business impact of COVID-19. And it's a true honor to introduce and welcome our Dean, Geoff Garrett, who will speak to you today about leading in uncertain times before, during, and after COVID-19. Prior to starting, though, I'd like to wish all of you, from all of us, healthy journey during this stay-at-home, safe distancing period, and thank you for tuning in. Quickly about how to work the platform. If you have questions for Dean Garrett, he is going to pause in the middle of his presentation and then take more questions at the end of his presentation. Please use the icon on your right-hand side that is Q&A. If you have a technical issue, please use the icon that is moderator chat, also on the right-hand side. And as you can see, many of you are already chatting in the just general chat. That's more the social buzz to do. So with that, I welcome you again to learn from our amazing Dean, Geoff Garrett, and he is speaking to you about leading in uncertain times before, during, and after COVID-19. With that, I pass it over to you, Dean Garrett. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to people from all over the world. Mike mentioned a bunch of the locations. Let me just give an extra shout out. I saw there was at least one person from my native Australia in Melbourne, so g'day to you. Look, we are living, I think, literally in unprecedented times. I try not to use hyperbolic language and extreme terms, but the words like unique, unprecedented are actually accurate for this period. And what I want to do today is to share with you my thinking about leadership. And I can tell you, I'll let you in on a secret, that I was actually thinking about this in January before the COVID-19 crisis hit the United States, before it even started in China. And my feeling today is just that the things I was thinking about, which struck me already as the big trends in our world and the challenge they create for leadership, are just now on steroids. So the rhythm of my presentation is going to be to say some things about the pre-COVID world, and then focus in on what we're all going through right now, and at least as important for me, how we're going to lead our way out of the crisis. So that's the rhythm of my presentation. Let me see if I can get the technology to work. I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you now, and I hope everybody can see this full screen where the destination check is leading in uncertain times before, during, and after COVID-19. So let me start with this observation that, again, I had in early January 2020, when I was thinking, like a lot of people, about making predictions for the year, making predictions for the decade. And it just struck me very, very early in January, I think when the US and Iran went to the brink of war, that the prediction business was just folly today because of the pervasive uncertainty in our world. But I want to unpack what uncertainty means into at least three dimensions. So the first part of uncertainty is just the sheer unpredictability of things in our world. So my first slide here is from 538.com, which is a famous tech organization in the US that predicts elections. They predicted a few elections right on the button in the United States. But on the day of the presidential election, November 8th, in 2016, 538.com thought that Donald Trump had a 28.6% chance of being elected president, and a couple of hours later, he was now the new president of the United States. But the unpredictability certainly isn't limited to politics. So here's a market example. Many of you probably know that Elon Musk at Tesla went to Wharton, so we're very proud of Elon and all that he's done. But talk about a roller coaster ride for one of his flagship companies, Tesla. Tesla stock went from $400 to $900, more than doubled in value in the first month and a half of this year. And I certainly don't know why, and I don't know who predicted that. But of course, then Tesla stock has taken a beating because of COVID-19. Who knows what the future will hold? But this is a roller coaster ride that I don't think anyone could have foreseen. Now, if you were smart enough to bet on Tesla on the way up and to have sold at $900, I say, God bless you, you've done an incredible job. But I just don't know how many people could have foreseen that. But then the third unpredictability, and now let's start weaving in some COVID-19, where we get the real-time data every day on what's happening globally, is this curve, right? Everyone talks about how exponential and geometric the COVID-19 curve is. Here it just is in a very simple metrics: total confirmed cases and total deaths associated with infection. And look at what's happened since the middle of March. So in 1 month, literally, the world has changed, and no one could have anticipated that. So first, the dimension of uncertainty is unpredictability, but I think there are two other important dimensions. So the second thing I want to talk about in uncertainty is just the pace of change. And this is pretty obvious graph that shows that the Steve Jobs launched the iPhone, I think, at the end of 2007. By 2009, there were 173 million smartphones sold in the world. By 2016, that was 1.5 billion. Talk about transformative technology, and it transformed our world in a decade. And just think about that in the COVID-19 context. We literally couldn't have conceived of remote workplaces if we didn't have information technology. Just do the thought experiment. How could we possibly have done what we're doing now in 1996? Maybe even in 2000, 2005, it would have been impossible, but today we can do it because of technological change. Now, it's not only looking backward, I think, that change is faster. That's going to continue in the next decade as well. And the obvious example there is the coming decade of artificial intelligence and AI. And so this is just a graph on projected AI software market, which will have exactly the same kind of growth curve as we saw with smartphones in the previous decade. We're going to see now with AI in the coming decade. Who knows what that AI world will look like, but it's bound to transform almost everything, and at warp speed. So the third example of change, of course, is now back to COVID-19, and this is the US unemployment data from the last 3 weeks. So down at the bottom there, you've got 50 years of initial unemployment claims in the United States. And they bounce around, but never did those claims, the weekly new claims, exceed 700,000 people in a single week. In the last 3 weeks, 17 million people have been added to the unemployment rolls in the United States, right? We have literally never seen anything like this. This is more extreme in a speed sense than the Great Depression was in the 1930s, although obviously unemployment reached 25-30% in the Great Depression, and we certainly hope, and I'm confident that won't happen in the coming COVID-19 recession, but the pace of change is just extraordinary. The third dimension of uncertainty is this new reality, which is, I think it's fair to say, largely tech-enabled, that we don't share facts anymore. We live in a world where there are alternate realities. So some dimensions of that, if you're in the United States, you know that if you channel surf on any given evening across the basic cable news platforms, Fox News on the right, CNN and MSNBC on the left. The Fox world is just a different world from the CNN world. They're not even debating the same topics. They just have a completely different lens into what's going on. That was obviously true in the United States at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020 with Donald Trump's impeachment, which was, unlike the previous impeachments, including Bill Clinton, I think it's fair to say, was a totally partisan affair. There was no room in the middle. There was no opportunity to talk about the merits of the case. We had these two worlds living in splendid isolation from each other. One, the pro-Donald Trump world was, this was the perfect call to Ukraine. The president was leading in the way he was supposed to do. The other world said, oh my God, Donald Trump is compromising national security so much that we need to remove him as president in a presidential election year. That was pretty extreme, but a couple of months before impeachment, I went from the United States to Hong Kong and then to China, and I was just struck by exactly the same thing with respect to the Hong Kong protesters. So in the Western media, you would see stories of brave protesters supporting democracy and human rights. In Hong Kong, and certainly on the mainland, instead you would see pictures of vandalism and violence associated with the protesters. Now, I think in this case, both things were there in the data. That is, that people in Hong Kong were protesting in favor of democracy and against what they considered unfair rule from Beijing. But at the same time, you could capture on television screens acts of vandalism, beating up ticket machines at MTR stations in Hong Kong. So both were true, but no media source had an incentive to bring those things together and have a debate about what was going on. We just had the alternate realities. And I'm going to show you later at the end of the presentation that right now in the United States, there is a remarkable partisan divide over COVID-19. And in essence, the divide is that Republican states, so-called red states in the United States, think COVID-19 is a much less big deal in a public health sense than people in Democratic states do, blue states. And conversely, people in Republican states think that the economic cost of COVID-19 is far greater than the public health risk. The converse is true for Democrats. So even in something that is, you would think, just an objective reality of the COVID-19 crisis, and we have public health experts telling us what's going on, and we have people modeling assumptions about what will happen, right? You'd think we would delegate this to the scientists. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that the world is just hyper-partisan in the US, even on COVID-19. Now, I want also to now add technology to this, and I'm going to use my own technology, which is to stop sharing my PowerPoint and show you a video. And it's a video about deep fakes, the use of technology literally to make things up and make them look real. Okay, the technology should now beam this to you. And as I said, it's a little over 1 minute. Please watch.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or how about this? Simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. It's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward And the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of dystopia. Thank you. And stay woke.
So the point of deepfakes that Jordan Peele is making there is, I think, a profound one, that technology gives us the opportunity literally to create facts. And in a world in which people already see the world in very, very different ways, this is profoundly disturbing and profoundly powerful, and it creates the possibility just to fragment societies even more than they already are. So this is in essence, the challenge. This is the end of the challenge part of my presentation. We're living in a world of pervasive uncertainty, unprecedented uncertainty on three dimensions. Everything is unpredictable. The pace of change is faster than ever before, and we don't know what a fact is anymore. That's a very challenging world. But I think it does create an opportunity for leaders. I just think we're going to need a different version of leadership than we've thought about historically. So let me talk a little bit about that for a while. My simple message to anyone who's in a position to lead is always be real. Don't try to be a hero. And I think this is important because we have had a sort of heroic view of leaders as people in whom we invest unlimited trust in a kind of unknowing way. And we want our leaders to be, one element of being a hero is to be a risk taker. And I just don't think that heroic version of leadership is the right one for us in this period of profound uncertainty. So let me explain why I think that's true. So the first dimension of being real for me is to be humble. And again, I just draw this contrast between our traditional view of leadership, which is follow me, I know the way. And those of us who are followers were always comfortable with that because we just wanted to place our trust in somebody else, into a newer world in which I think leaders are going to have to say, listen, I think I'm pretty smart. I know I work hard, but I just don't have all the answers, and I need help. I need help from you. So I think a key dimension of leadership right now is to own your limitations. You know, people are talking a lot about authenticity, and I think that's appropriate, but authenticity needs to be put in context. And again, I would call it more humility, that leaders need to be a little humbler than historically we've thought of them. Second dimension is really transparency and openness. And I think here, you know, it's pretty obvious the incentives for leaders to play your cards close, to focus group things before you act, and to sort of be economical with the truth in the sense of only conveying information that you think shines a positive light on you or your organization. You know, I think a recent example of this is Boeing's handling of the 737 MAX crisis for them, which obviously has now put Boeing in an existentially challenged position because of COVID-19 coming on top of 737 MAX. But instead of leadership that keeps things close and is economical with the truth, I think we need from our leaders what I would call a kind of explainer in chief role. And what that means, I think, is to say, listen, I know the world is complex. I'm going to try to explain it to you from my perspective in ways that are simple but not simplistic. And if you can do that, I think the plus is that you'll actually bring people along with you. If they get it, if they understand what the challenge is, they're much more likely to help you get to a successful resolution than if they have a jaundiced view that says you're not actually sharing what's really going on. So this is, you know, openness and transparency are a core element of trust. I just wanted to unpack that concept a little bit. And then the third dimension is as much as anything else, I think it's about generational change. You know, the kind of Milton Friedman view of the world for companies, for example, that they've just got to be all about maximizing profits and looking after investors and owners, just doesn't sit well with a millennial and even more, I think, a Gen Z world in which younger people are mission-driven and purpose-oriented. And I think what that means is that younger people are potentially inspired by leaders, but they want their leaders to be just as committed and just as human as they are. And we're seeing that through the sort of the move towards going from maximizing profits to maximizing social value. I would expect that's going to become even more true post-COVID-19, and I think even more true as the workforce, certainly in Western countries, the workforce changes dramatically. So those are my three dimensions of being a real leader. What I'd now like to do is to show you a couple of brief COVID-19 leadership clips that I think exemplify this. And after these two clips, which I'll react to very briefly, I'd love to find out how you've been reacting to everything I've talked about so far. So I'm going to pause and take some questions. But let me see now if I can go to Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, who, let me just set this up. You'll probably remember that it's now a month ago, Angela Merkel came out and said that 2/3 of Germany was likely to get the COVID-19 virus. She did it in a televised national address that the beginning of which I'm going to share with you now.
Deswegen lassen Sie mich sagen, es ist ernst. Nehmen Sie es auch ernst. Seit der deutschen Einheit, nein, seit dem Zweiten Weltkrieg, gab es keine Herausforderung an unser Land mehr, bei der es so sehr auf unser gemeinsames, solidarisches Handeln ankommt. Ich möchte Ihnen erklären, wo wir aktuell stehen in der Epidemie, was die Bundesregierung und die staatlichen Ebenen tun, um alle in unserer Gemeinschaft zu schützen und den ökonomischen, sozialen, kulturellen Schaden zu begrenzen. Aber ich möchte Ihnen auch vermitteln, warum es Sie dafür braucht und was jeder und jede Einzelne dazu beitragen kann. Zur Epidemie. Und alles, was ich Ihnen dazu sage, kommt aus den ständigen Beratungen der Bundesregierung mit den Experten des Robert-Koch-Instituts und anderen Wissenschaftlern und Virologen. Es wird weltweit unter Hochdruck geforscht, aber noch gibt es weder eine Therapie gegen das Coronavirus, noch
So Angela Merkel there said, I think, three things that were key to what 1 month later looks like a successful German effort to flatten the COVID-19 curve. The first thing she did was she talked about seriousness. And for a German to say that this was the biggest crisis facing the country since World War II was quite extraordinary. Second, she said, this is not something that I'm going to lead from Berlin. It's something that the 80 million plus people in Germany are going to have to actively be involved in. And third, she said, I'm listening to and I'm going to trust the science. And that was very early on, right? At that time in Germany, there were relatively few cases. I think at the time, this was March 19, I think Italy was the only country in Europe that was really in the grips of the crisis. But Merkel acted at the time, some people thought preemptively, to ring the alarm bell in Germany. And 1 month later, I think that looks like a real example of leadership. Let me now show you a corporate example, which is Arne Sorensen, the CEO of Marriott International, one of the largest hotel management companies in the world, obviously. And the setup for this, by the way, is I think for many, this is Arne Sorensen talking to his employees, associates of Marriott all over the world. And I think many people would literally have been shocked to see him because they remember a man in great health with a wonderful head of hair who is now bald because he's going through cancer treatment. And this is what they saw from their CEO.
Hello, Marriott Associates. I'm here to give you an update on the impact of coronavirus, or COVID-19, on our business and the steps we're taking to respond to it. Because of the profound impact COVID-19 is having on so many of us around the world, this is the most difficult video message we have ever pulled together. Our team was a bit concerned about using a video today because of my new bald look. Let me just say that my new look is exactly what was expected as a result of my medical treatments. I feel good, and my team and I are 100% focused on overcoming the common crisis we face. Now let's talk about that crisis, COVID-19. Let's start with the health challenge itself. Across our company, the number of COVID-19 infected associates is low, and I'm grateful for this. I want to acknowledge the associates who are dealing with it as a patient, a parent, family member, or friend, and the hundreds of Marriott colleagues who are at this minute quarantined. Our well wishes and thoughts are with all of you. In terms of our business, COVID-19 is like nothing we've ever seen before. For a company that's 92 years old, that's borne witness to the Great Depression, World War II, and many other economic and global crises, that's saying something. But here are the facts. COVID-19 is having a more severe and sudden financial impact on our business than 9/11 and the 2009 financial crisis combined. The worst.
Okay, so I think that's the right place to end that message, that extraordinary message from Arnie Sorensen to everyone who works at Marriott. And just notice about it that he owned his cancer treatment up front. Then the first thing he talked about with respect to the crisis was the health and well-being, not only of everyone who works for Marriott International, but also everyone in their families, all of their friends. And then third, he went straight to the depth of the crisis and he said these two extraordinary things. We've been around since before the Depression. This is bigger than the Depression. And for those of you who have real memories of the 21st century, this is a bigger deal than 9/11 plus the financial crisis combined. And he said all of that in under 1 minute. I thought it was an extraordinary example of leadership. So I'm going to stop right there. I wonder what questions have been coming in. I'm going to focus much more on COVID-19 in the second half, but I'm going to pause right here and see if anyone has any reactions to anything I've already said.
Dean Garrett, your examples of uncertainty are clear, but if people cannot agree on what the actual facts are, how can we build a common language to discuss the challenges that we all face?
It's a massive challenge. And again, I think of the three dimensions of leadership I was talking about, I think they're all important, but I really want to underscore this notion of explainer in chief, that, we live in a dizzyingly complex world where facts are all contested. And so if you're a leader, I think you have to make sense out of that complexity and to show, quote unquote, what's really going on. And that's a monumental challenge. But my instinct there is that you need to build up credibility. Going in, people have to want to trust what you're saying, but then you owe it to them in response to be really clear about what's going on and not sugarcoat things. So for me there, the simple sentence would be simple without being simplistic. Make things clear without talking down to people. I think that's the leadership challenge. And again, if you look at the two videos I just showed, Angela Merkel and Arnie Sorensen, I think that's what they were doing. They weren't sugarcoating anything. They were talking about the magnitude of the crisis. They said it calmly. They said they're going to need everybody's help to get to the other side. And I think that's just what leaders must do in this environment.
Dean Garrett, in terms of actual leadership, which leaders have stood out to you in the recent months or weeks for their crisis management? positive or negative?
Yeah, I think I'd go with the positive examples. I don't think there's a lot of utility in criticizing people in this environment. I'm in California right now, and California looks like it's going to be a relative success story. If you were looking at the things that have made New York such a challenged state and city in the United States, what were they? Big global city, lots of global interactions, high population density, all the stuff that has created such incredible challenges for the city and state of New York. You would have thought that both of those things would have been true in California too. And certainly there was early evidence that the crisis was about to mushroom in San Francisco. But what happened in California is coordinated action by the mayors of San Francisco and Los Angeles and the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, in ways that, being in California, I thought felt a little extreme to me in advance. Why are we locking down the state when there are so few cases here? 3 weeks later, they look very prescient to me. So those were extraordinarily tough decisions that political leaders did at a time when they could have been second-guessed big time for being too extreme in their reactions. But in retrospect, it looks like what they've done has, in essence, saved California from the worst of the crisis. Now, of course, there's still history to be written, but right now, I think that's what the data are suggesting to us. And I do think it's an example of coordinated example of great political leadership, which now, of course, as of yesterday in the US, looks like it might expand because the three West Coast states, the three states on the Pacific in the US, Oregon, Washington, and California, have now said that they will act in concert in terms of the strategies for ending the economic lockdown and shutdown of the West Coast economies.
Dean Garrett, how can a leader help relieve anxiety and improve resilience on his team, his or her team, during these circumstances?
Yeah, I think obviously, very good question. I think you've got to show compassion and empathy. So empathy first, just really get where people are coming from, particularly if they've got, very visceral concerns like, how is my health going to be going forward? Am I at risk of dying ultimately? Or is my job at risk? And how can I work in this environment where I'm concerned about the future of my own employment? You've got to empathize with that. And then I think you've got to be compassionate, stage two, which I think going from empathy to compassion really means doing something about it. So in the health case, per Arne Sorensen, I think you just have to say, listen, your health is my highest priority. It's the first thing I've got to do as a leader. And then the second dimension would be thinking about guaranteeing employment, which right now is some combination of what a company can do and support you can get from the federal government. Just think about the small business loans that are being extended in the US. But I don't think that compassion and empathy is enough. I think you need to go further and be able to say, listen, we do have a plan here. And again, don't make the plan something that's hyped up and I'm the hero, trust me. Don't think about things that are going to sound good. Be really real in the challenges you face and what you think about as the opportunities moving forward. And I actually want to talk about that, what I'd like to call the 3 stages of crisis leadership in the next part of this session.
I can take one more question before we go on here. With the changing role of leadership and the perception of leadership in America, do you think this is going to play a role in the upcoming election or elections that are coming up?
No question, and let me just defer my answer to that question until I get to the partisan divide that we're experiencing now in the United States over COVID-19 and the challenges that raise, the leadership challenges it raises, as well as future of the country, I think. So thanks very much. Great question. And it allows me to segue to the next part of my presentation. Let's see if the technology will get us back to my PowerPoint deck. So that was Angela Merkel, Arnie Sorensen. There is Arnie, by the way, with his full head of hair right before his cancer treatment. Just imagine how everyone who had not seen him at Marriott was feeling when they saw him on March 19. So let's now talk about leading through a crisis, and through in this case I underline because that means getting to the other side as well as getting through it right now. And you know, I've been thinking about this both conceptually, but also actually in my day job as dean of the Wharton School. And I'm thinking about really right now 3 stages of crisis leadership that is so evident in COVID-19. So the first stage is just to react and respond to the shock and stabilize whatever you can. And I think, you know, those of us running organizations in the past month, certainly in the United States and Europe, that's the world we've been living in, a react and respond world. But you can't only react and respond. You have to think about what happens next. And so I'd say that I think the second stage of crisis leadership is to be realistic about what the implications or the longer term implications of the crisis are, and readjust your expectations and your plans as quickly as possible, probably still while you're living in react and respond. You're still in the depth of the crisis, the kind of frenetic activity when you're just responding. But at the same time, you need to start thinking about what happens next. And you know, the simplest way to think about this is what are the financial implications of our response to the crisis for my organization, and how am I going to stabilize things and readjust plans as soon as possible? But then the third step, which is so important and so hard to do when you're in the depth of a crisis, is to be proactive in thinking about not only a kind of passive rebound to a new normal, but to be proactive about that. What can we learn from the crisis? What can we take out of the crisis that will actually make us better in the future? What will increase the probability of, at an organizational level, a V-shaped recovery, which is, yes, the descent is really steep, but let's make the ascent as steep as possible too. And you don't do that by being passive. You do that by being proactive and thinking about what you can do better and differently as a result of the crisis. And, you know, this is the never waste a good crisis was a term that Rahm Emanuel, who was an advisor to Barack Obama, used in 2009. And of course, he got criticized for that because it seemed so cynical, never waste a good crisis. But I think what he was saying less cynically was, there are things that you can do. There's an opening up to be creative, to think about things that maybe you've always wanted to do, but you thought they were just organizationally impossible because of internal politics, status quo bias, all that kind of stuff. Maybe now you have the opportunity to do them so that when things get better, once you've got to the bottom, you've established a floor in the crisis, you can actually move forward. So an example of this that I'll just show very briefly is now a few weeks ago. I'm an enormous NBA fan. I know many people around the world are, and we're all missing our NBA basketball. This is Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, in a very early interview with Rachel Nichols from ESPN about how the NBA had just stopped and what was Silver going to do next. So let me see if I can get to that place. I've just had something on my screen that's made that harder, but I think I can overcome it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and share a video with you now of Adam Silver, the NBA commissioner.
With each day now, we're getting all this new information. So I'm not going to ask you to predict the future on the next 6 months, but as that new information has come, what criteria are you going to be using to decide when and if you can resume? For example, the CDC has recommended no gatherings of more than 50 people for at least 2 months. So what is the point where you're going to feel, okay, we can actually talk about resuming?
Well, to your point about not predicting the future, I've certainly learned sort of in this job and in this process that when people do pretend they can predict the future, they're generally wrong. And I'd say look no further than the fact that certainly 2 weeks ago and even a week ago, people were saying very different things than they're saying today. And so, of course, one of the things that we're very focused on at the league office and together with our teams is what are the conditions we would need to restart. And I'd say I'm looking at three different things here. One is, of course, when can we restart and operate as we've known it, 19,000 fans in buildings, and sort of that's one set of criteria. Then option two is, how would we, should we consider restarting without fans, and what would that mean? Because presumably, if you had a group of players and staff around them, and you could test them, and you could follow some protocol, doctors, health officials may say it's safe to play. So that's sort of second set of circumstances. And then the third option that we're looking at now, and I would say all suggestions welcome, is that as I sort of beginning of this interview, I've mentioned the impact to me on the national psyche of having no sports programming on television. And one of the things we've been talking about, are there conditions in which a group of players could compete, and maybe it's for a giant fundraiser or just for the collective good of the people, that you take a subset of players, and is there a protocol in which they can be tested and quarantined or isolated in some way?
So if you think about Adam Silver there, this is a long time ago. This is March 19, and he said, listen, I don't know what's going to happen. And then he went very quickly to scenarios for getting the NBA back, not the way the NBA was before, 19,000 people in a stadium, but maybe a hermetically sealed group of players in some location. And then he added to that the acknowledgement that live sports has become just such a central part of so many people's lives. Could they do live sports in a way that could be an enormous fundraiser to support people adversely affected by the crisis? It's pretty remarkable that he did that in 2 minutes on live television, beginning with just lots and lots of doses of humility. So I was very impressed with that, and who knows what's going to happen with live sports, but certainly it does seem to me that there's potentially a pathway where a lot of sporting activity could happen. There just won't be fans in the stands. There'll be lots of us watching on TV. And I, for one, would enjoy that because you might hear much more of what's actually going on among the players and between coaches and players. But let me go back to sharing my screen now, because I do have some more information that I want to get through. First thing, let me just talk very briefly about the 3 stages of crisis leadership that I'm feeling right now at the Wharton School. The responding to the crisis for us was all about creating something that we called Remote Wharton, that was moving all of our classes online. And in essence, we had 2 weeks to do that. It was exhausting, absolutely exhausting to go through, but also pretty exhilarating. The scale, 625 online classes were mounted, 250 professors were teaching, and we launched a new class on what COVID-19 means for business that I'm part of. And because we're now not constrained by lecture halls on campus, it's actually the largest class in the history of the Wharton School, with about 2,500 students now taking the class and underscoring, we hope, the relevance of the school in real time to things that are affecting everyone in the world and everything around the world. But of course, we also have to be thinking about what happens next for the higher education marketplace. What's the price of remote higher education? Do you price it similarly to face-to-face or not, with enormous implications no matter what you do there? Second, let's think about this from an economic standpoint. Some parts of higher education are typically pro-cyclical. That is, when the economy goes down, there's less demand for your products. We think of our executive MBA for fully employed people as potentially a pro-cyclical degree. But conversely, MBA historically has been full-time. Residential MBA has been a counter-cyclical degree. The opportunity costs of doing the degree go down in an economic downturn. So maybe MBA, full-time MBA will be relatively stronger compared with executive MBA. And then this massive question for all the globally integrated schools and universities, what's going to happen with international students where we have not only formal travel restrictions, we have slowdowns in visa processing, and then we have all the concerns just at the individual level about international travel, and do we want to be around people from other countries? Enormous issues for us. But then on the upside, the sort of taking advantage of the crisis, there are some opportunities for us to change how we teach in ways that might actually be better. And there's been a concept for several years now of the flipped classroom, which means that in essence, you put lecture-like material online in the can. People can view it at their leisure. They can speed up, they can slow down. But then when they do face-to-face things, it should be interactive, problem-solving, team-oriented, all of the things that we know are higher value than the lecture-like material. We've known this before the crisis. Maybe there's more chance we can do it now. And then, right now, Wharton has a facility in Beijing. If China opens up more quickly than the rest of the world, certainly than the United States, can we take advantage of the fact that we have operations not only in Philadelphia, but also in Beijing and San Francisco? Can we take advantage of that? It now looks like Philadelphia is really quite close to the center of the crisis in the United States now. Maybe Wharton's other locations are an advantage. And then rethinking the importance of physical plant is clearly something everyone's going to do. Everyone in the world, universities will be no exception to that. But now let me go. I'm going to end with sort of this invidious, impossible trade-off between health and the economy. And I'm just going to show you a very simple comparison between two countries that on so many dimensions look very similar, Norway and Sweden. So here are their COVID-19 curves as of yesterday, I think. And they look kind of similar. You could certainly say that Norway spiked more quickly, but the curves are not so radically different, although now again, we don't know about the future, but the responses of the two countries to the crisis were completely different. So Norway enacted a national lockdown on March the 12th, and immediately unemployment spiked to 14%. Now, unemployment is going up in Sweden as well, but it's under 6% as of last week. But if you look at the deaths from COVID-19 in those two countries, you'll see that Norway has very, very few deaths, and Sweden has more. Now, Sweden not tracking Italy, the US, Spain, but nonetheless more COVID-19 associated deaths. So how do you choose? If talk about an impossible position. If you're a government in any country today, you know that stopping the economy is going to create lots of unemployment and adversely affect the most disadvantaged people in your society. But if you don't lock down the country, you run the risk of more deaths associated with the disease. That is a leadership challenge. Let me now talk about it in the United States, where we have something like a Norway-Sweden division, but within the country. So here's just some numbers that I crunched that show you a remarkable thing, that there are just not only many more total COVID-19 cases in states that Hillary Clinton won in 2016 than those Donald Trump won, but even when you control for population size, the incidence of COVID-19 infections is twice as high in blue states as red states. That leads to remarkable differences in public attitudes between people who identify as Democrats and as Republicans. And Republicans care twice as much about the economy, the impact of COVID-19 on the economy as Democrats do. And Democrats are much more concerned about the public health consequences. And of course, this has affected behavior. This is a curve from The Economist about who's actually socially distancing in the US. And the slope of this curve says that there is less social distancing in places where in states where Donald Trump won more votes. And these three points here, I don't want to talk about causality. I don't know what leads to what, but they all go together. We have more cases in Democratic states. We have more concern about public health in Democratic states, and we have more social distancing in Democratic states. The exact converse is true for Republicans, and this is clearly the challenge that Donald Trump is facing right now as president of the United States. So maybe I'm going to stop right there. There's one last slide I have, but I'd like to get people's reactions to what I've just said now about leadership during the COVID-19 crisis. Are there any questions?
Yes, Dean Garrett. So what would be the impact on industries where physical presence of staffs are required and they cannot operate remotely?
Yeah, it's impossible right now. But I think let's play this forward a little bit. Where physical presence is either essential or highly desirable. This is a question that we're facing right now with respect to universities. We want to put people back in classrooms. But what happens if we have to practice social distancing going forward, not only for the next few weeks, but maybe for the next few months, the next few years? What does that mean? Well, and let's talk about how that could happen. You could either have regulations, government orders could tell you that there'd be limitations on how many people you could have in a given physical space. But there could also be just the concerns of individuals. We're concerned not only about how our students will feel about being in classrooms, but also our faculty and staff. Do they want to be in those classrooms? So I think this is going to be an enormous challenge. And again, we don't have the answers yet, but we're thinking that in a university environment, a socially distanced on-campus experience, we could operate at maximum at 50% of our normal capacity. Well, what does that mean for the business? This is going to be an extraordinary challenge. Even once we go back to a normal, it's just going to be a very different new normal, I think.
Dean Garrett, in your example of the Norway versus Sweden, which was an effective leadership style in your opinion?
Well, clearly, I think what people would say in this case, somewhat objectively, is that Norway had both a reason to lock down and an opportunity to lock down that maybe wasn't there in Sweden. So in the Norway case, it did look like cases were spiking dramatically, and that's when the government acted. But Norway, as I think most people know, has the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, which is an enormous cushion for what is a small country. You have $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund in a country of under 10 million people. So we can understand why the Norwegian government wanted to and was able to act so quickly. The Swedish government story, of course, is the other side, where they say, listen, we think Swedes are sufficiently responsible that they'll practice social distancing even without the kind of draconian orders that have come in so many other government environments. So again, I'm not going to score it here, but these are two dramatically different paths where maybe the Norwegian path was just more available because of the incredible nest egg that Norway has as a result of its sovereign fund.
Dean Garrett, we have a lot of good questions coming in, but given that we're coming up on time, I'll come to one of the more popular questions that we're coming across is, how do you see the COVID-19 change the dynamics of the U.S.-China trade war? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, so very simple on the trade war. The big commitment that China made in phase one was to increase purchases of American products by $200 billion. I just don't see how that's going to be possible, even though the Chinese have said that they're obviously going to try to continue to meet meet their targets. And Donald Trump is talking about Chinese purchases of agriculture and manufacturing and energy from the US. So I don't think the letter of the trade deal will be able to be met. But ironically, what was already happening because of the trade war and now will only be accentuated by COVID-19 is that the trade deficit between the US and China is going to go way down. It went down almost $100 billion in 2019. But that wasn't because Chinese people were buying more American products. It was because American people were buying fewer Chinese products. So trade deficit down, but really hard for China to meet the letter of the phase one deal. For 2020, I think neither side is going to want to prosecute that case very hard, I don't think, because the situation is just so extraordinary. But going forward, I think that the trend towards decoupling, particularly in supply chains, is going to continue because everyone's going to want to shorten their supply chain. And obviously now there's concern in the US about how reliant America is on Chinese provision of health services. And of course, China has incentives to develop their own indigenous healthcare innovations. So I think longer term decoupling is just going to continue. And I find that actually very regrettable because I think it's the ties between the US and China that create a lot of geopolitical stability in our world.
So Dean Garrett, I'll end with this question. So with all the uncertainty that we have going on here, how do you balance authenticity and what the facts are versus your confidence in a crisis like this as a leader? How do you balance the two?
Well, I don't think it's a balance. I think you absolutely need both. So signaling calm, competence, fact-based is just absolutely essential. But so is authenticity, because you want to be viewed as being really human, which is why I've been underscoring the be real element of leadership. I just think, given the pervasive uncertainty in our world, you've got to be real. And like Adam Silver, very often the beginning of that is going to be to say, listen, I'm pretty close to the action. I work really hard, but I don't have the answers, and I've just got to own up to that. So establish a baseline that says, I'm telling you the truth, and then say, given that baseline, here's what I can do as a calm, competent, fact-based leader to try to reason and then to plan our way out of the crisis. It's an enormous challenge, but I do think it's a great leadership opportunity as well.
So we're coming up on the end of time here, so we'll stop with the questions here. I'll turn it back over to you, Dean Garrett, for some final thoughts.
Yeah, so I hope this has been a useful session for everybody. I'm just going to end with what was my last slide, which is something I developed as something to say to Wharton students. Again, well before the crisis, but it feels just right to me right now, which is what I'd say to everybody is, listen, there's so much reason right now to be pessimistic, doom and gloom. All the scenario planning you do is negative. But I think the thing that gets us all up in the morning is being optimistic. But I don't think you can afford to be naively optimistic. You've got to be a realistic optimist. And I think that was always true. I think it's even more true today. So I think that would be my final message to everybody who's been online, and thanks for your participation. These are extraordinary times. It's unprecedented. But I think viewing everything from a position of the realistic optimist is certainly the best place to start. So with that, should I just close out the event? I can see that we're at the hour, and attendees are moving on to other parts of their day. On behalf of the Wharton School, Wharton Executive Education, I want to thank everyone for your participation today. And of course, the last things to say are thank you for your participation. Stay safe and be healthy.